In the previous part, we went through finishing off the central machine. In this section, we'll be looking at the attachments to that machine. And in the next video, we'll finish the modeling and then Martin can get into some painting workflows. Again, like last time, I'll start with a breakdown of what to expect in this section and some of the key tools and ideas used. We'll start with some organization, in particular the very handy layer management add-on. Then it's on with the modeling of the attachments. First up, it's the triple dish. There we'll make mention that you can automatically add a subdivision surface modifier onto an object with the Control and 1 shortcut, turning a cube into something much more sphere-like basically. We'll also look at selecting sharp angles automatically. The next attachment will be the laser gun, and here we'll briefly go over pressing F to fill a face. Then the last attachment will be the claw. For this we'll model with curves using a bevel object and a taper object to get the desired profile and overall shape to it. In some of the tools we can hold shift for more precise controls as we move our mouse. Then we'll convert the curve into a mesh, and we'll use the shortcut Control A to apply rotation and scale. To finish off the attachments, we'll use rotation using local coordinates by pressing the axis key twice, and we'll also do some scaling using individual origins. So now over to Martin to demonstrate all that and get into the details.
Zooming out then, before I move on I just want to clean up a couple of things. I've got this Boolean cutting object I used earlier on, so I'm going to select that and delete it. And I'm also going to select the torus objects and make them smooth, just to make the whole thing look a bit nicer. And another thing I've noticed, if I just go back to the concept, where these pivot objects are, there's this wider, more beveled shaped one, and then this smaller one here. But looking at this armature, the bevel one is at the lower joint, and it seems as if the smaller cylinder is kind of like, imagine like the screw thread for the wider object. So what I want to do is go back to my object. I'm just going to select that and then hide everything else. And what I'm actually going to do is, instead of this being completely symmetrical, I'm going to select these parts here on one side and then mirror them along this axis. So I'm going to go into edit mode and drop my current selection, and then I'm going to hover over each of these parts and press L to select linked, and then I want to change my pivot point back to median, and now I just want to mirror them across the x-axis. So I'm going to press Ctrl M and then X and then press enter, and as before it's flipped the normals, so I'm going to press Ctrl F and then flip those back the right way. So I think that's closer to the concept now. So I'm going to bring everything back with Alt and H, and now it's time to move on. Now it's time to start making the attachments for each of the armatures, and I'm going to start with this dish object here. Before I begin making these new objects, I want to arrange what I've currently got a bit better. We've been using the layer system up till now, and it's pretty good, but there is an add-on that will allow me to use layers a bit more efficiently. So I'm going to go to my File menu and User Preferences. And if I just type in layer in the search bar, it will give me this add-on called layer management. So I'm going to tick that on, and if you click the drop down you can see that it creates a layers tab in the tool shelf. So if I save my user settings and then close that, down here now I have a tab called layer, and up here in the layer management section I can open that, and it gives me a more detailed representation of what's going on down here with the standard layers. And all of that still works the same way, but this just gives me a few more options to work with. So I want to look at the layers that I've currently got and give them names. So first of all, I'm going to unhide all of the layers. And there's an option up here, I'm just going to expand this out, called hide empty. So if I tick that on, it will only show me layers that have an object on there. So first of all, the first layer has the cavern. So I'm going to click in the name field and call that cavern. And the machine is on layer 2, so I'm going to call that machine. And layer 3 has the conveyor belt, so conveyor. And layer 4 has the pipes. And layer 5 has my characters. Okay, another useful thing that you'll see with this add-on is there's a material button here at the end. So for example, say with the cavern layer, I can click that and it will change it to wireframe, and that allows me to see objects as wireframe while still being in solid view, and that can be really useful because I can use an object as a reference and model another object without the view getting cluttered, and that's something we'll be doing next when I make this attachment. So what I'm going to do is just hide the layers that I don't need. I do need the machine, and I want to select this stand-in object we've got at the end of the armature here. So I'm going to select it and then duplicate it and then right click and leave it in place. But because I've just duplicated it, there's a relationship line showing that it's actually still parented to the armature. So I want to press Alt and P and then clear the parent, and that will move that down towards the origin, and that's because after parenting we use the armature to move that up to meet the torus. Next I want to place that on its own layer, so I'm going to press M as I've done in the past and then move that to layer 6. And then I can switch on that layer and then switch off the machine layer. So for this layer I want to use this box as a kind of a reference, and I want to be able to see through it while also working in solid view. So what I'm going to do is first of all position this a bit better. So I'm going to go into my front view and then put the object back to the origin. I'm going to do that by clicking in the properties shelf for location and typing 0. And next I want to rotate it, so R90. And in my top view, I'm going to rotate it so that we're not seeing the side of this object, we're seeing the front. So going into top view, I'm going to R90 again. And also, if I go back to my front view, the origin point for this is at the origin, and I want the object to be in the center of the world. So I want to press Shift, Control, Alt and C, and then choose Origin to Geometry, and then press Shift and S, and then move Selection to Cursor. Okay, next I want to create a cylinder. So I'm going to go into Wireframe and then press Shift and A and then Mesh Cylinder, and I want it to be aligned to my view, and I'm going to change the vertices value to 16, and this is going to be the base object of this attachment. So I want it to be quite a bit smaller than it currently is. I'm just going to click and drag in the radius field and bring that down to something like that. Looking at it in an ortho view, it's still very deep, so I'm going to click and drag in the depth slider and change that to something more like that. Okay, now I'm basically happy with the start of this object. I'm going to move this to its own layer, so I'm going to press M again and then move this to layer 7. So if I use my layer management to bring that back and then go into solid view, I can click on my reference layer and change that to wireframe. So now I can model my object using this as a basic reference bounding box. Another great feature of this add-on is that I can lock objects. So I can use this padlock icon to lock the layer, and then I can't accidentally select the objects on that layer. So with that done, I want to move this cylinder back, and I want to go into edit mode and select the face at the end here. So I'm going to go into face mode and select it, and I'm going to inset this. So I'm going to press I and then just bring that down to something like that, and then I'm going to move that forwards just to give it a bit of a shape at the front there. And next I want to extrude this, so I'm going to press E, and I also want to extrude it another couple of times. So I'm going to press E again and again, and then I want to scale this section of the object here. So I'm going to expand my selection with Control and plus on the number pad, and then I want to scale this in the X and the Z. So I'm going to press S and then Shift Y and bring that up to something like that, I think. Okay, next I want to select the face at the end again, and I want to inset it. So I'm going to bring that down to about there, and then again bring that forwards like this. And if anything, I think it could do with being a little bit smaller, something like that. Okay, so now I want to extrude again and bring that forwards. And although I am going outside of this bounding box, I'll be changing the proportions of this, and also the bounding box is only a very rough guide. I'm not intending it to be exactly within these boundaries. So with that face extruded, I want to scale that right down so that that becomes that kind of pointed shape at the front of the dish object. Okay, next I want to move this wider section a little bit further back, I think. So I'm going to drop my selection and go into wireframe view, and then box select those faces and then just move them back. and then I'm going to move them a bit further back and then deselect these faces. So I'm going to do B and then middle click and move those faces to make a more of a steep angle there. And I think that's not a bad start for that object. The next thing I want to make is the dish object. So what I'm going to do for this is go back into my front view and press Shift A and then go Mesh and then UV Sphere. And I want this to align to my view so that the central vertex is aligned front to back. And I'm pretty happy with the segments, even though that's quite a few divisions in the object. Because it's quite a prominent feature, I want it to be nice and round. So I'm going to leave that at 32. And I'm going to change the size so it's a bit more appropriate. So I'm going to go into wireframe, and in my ortho view, I'm just going to scale that down a little bit. Let's try 0.5. Yeah, I think that will do. I only really need the end of the sphere. The rest of it is going to be deleted. So in my side view, I can go into edit mode, and I'm going to box select and deselect the faces at the end here, about the first 4 segments or so. So I'm going to press B and then middle click and deselect those faces, and then I'm going to press X and delete the remainder. Okay, so back in my solid view, I've now got this dish object. And if anything, I could probably lose another edge loop there. So I'm going to Alt and right click on one of the edges of those faces and then just delete those as well. Okay, so back in object mode, I'm going to move that further forwards and get it roughly in place. And I'd like to make it a little bit larger. So I'm going to press Shift and H to hide everything else. And I want to move my origin point to be at the end where this vertex is. So I'm going to go into edit mode and vertex mode and then select this vertex in the center, and then I can press Shift and S and move cursor to selected. Then back in object mode, I can do Shift Control Alt and C and move origin to 3D cursor. So now if I bring everything back with Alt and H, I can select my dish and then just scale that up. I think something like that. Perhaps a little bit smaller. I think that's okay. So now I need to give the dish some thickness. So back in edit mode and face mode, I'm going to select all of my faces with A and then press Alt and E and extrude on region vertex normals. So as I extrude that out, I'm going to press Shift just to place it exactly where I want it. I don't want it too thick. I think something like that will be fine. Okay, and then back in object mode, I want to move it a little bit further forwards, something like that. Yeah, I think that's fine. Okay, next thing I want to make is a couple of torus objects to go at the front here on this kind of spike antenna thing. So again, back in my front view, I'm going to do Shift and A, and then Mesh, and then Torus. And I want it to align to my view, and I want to remove some of the divisions. So I'm going to change the segments to, let's try 24. And I want to change the minor segments to 8. And then I need to make it quite a bit smaller. So I'm going to scroll down here to the major radius. I'm just going to click, and I'll do this in wireframe. It's a bit confusing because at the moment the torus is still quite thick. So let's change that to 0.1. And let's change the major radius to, let's try 0.2. Okay, so it's about the right size, I think, but it's still very thick. So let's change this to 0.05. And again, still very thick, 0.025. I think that's more like it. So now I can click and drag that object further forwards to roughly the right sort of position. And I'm going to edit mode and then press Alt and S for the shrink fatten tool. And just bring that up so it's a little bit thicker. And then back in object mode, I can duplicate it with Shift D and then Y, and then move it forwards and then scale it down to something like that, I think. Okay, next I want to create the ball that appears at the end of the antenna. Because it's quite a small object, I don't want to make an actual sphere with lots of geometry in it. So I'm going to create a cube. So I'm going to do Shift A and then Mesh, Cube. And the simplest way to make this kind of rounder would be to add a modifier and go to subdivision surface and add that. But there's a quicker way of getting there. You can press Ctrl 1 and that will create a subdivision surface modifier with a division of 1, which is exactly what I want. So with that in place, I can just apply that and make it just geometry again. And now I want to scale this down to be the small ball at the end of the antenna. So I'm going to go into wireframe and I'm going to position it roughly in the right place and then scale it down. And in my side view, I'm just going to refine that a little bit. Something like that, I think. Okay, so back in my ortho view, I think I've got the basic shapes in place. I just want to refer back to the concept. I think this larger section in the middle of this kind of stalk is a bit thicker, and I also think the torus objects need to be a bit closer to that area as well, a bit further back. So back in edit mode, I'm going to Shift and Alt and right click on one of the edges that makes up that band of faces at the back, and I want to move them all further back to begin with, and I'm going to leave a bit of clearance between that and the dish, and then I want to Alt and right click on the central band of faces there and then scale them on the Z and the X axis. So I'm going to press S and then Shift Y and then just move that up so that it becomes a bit thicker. And I also want to move the torus objects further back, so I'm going to go into object mode and select them and just move them a little bit further back. Okay, I think that's not too bad. I think that will do. And what I want to do now is add some smoothing to this object. So I'm going to select the main stalk, as it were. And what I'm going to do first is show you another way of selecting edges ready for smoothing. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then edge mode and then drop my current selection. In the past we've been selecting edges and then marking them as sharp, or we've been going over to the data context and using the auto smooth option and choosing an angle. And this is kind of similar to that. What I can do with no edges selected, I can go down here to the select menu and then choose sharp edges. And if I go up here on the options, it gives me a sharpness degree value, much the same as the angle in the auto smooth options works. So that's selecting all of the edges within a 30-degree threshold. And I think that's a pretty good job. That's pretty much what I'd like to make sharp. So with those selected, I can press Ctrl and E and then mark sharp. Before I move on though, I want to select the edges at the ends of this larger cylinder and bevel them. So I'm going to drop my current selection and then Alt and right click and then Shift and Alt and right click those edge loops and then press Ctrl B for bevel and just bring those in somewhere like that, I think. Okay, and also I have a face at the very end of this object that I want to delete, so I'm going to go into wireframe and face mode, and I want to make sure I have no selections by pressing A and then box select this face at the very end and then delete it. Okay, so back in object mode and solid view, I want to select the dish now and use that selection method to choose the edges I'd like to make sharp. So I'm going to drop my current selection and go into edge mode and then do select sharp edges, and again it's chosen 30 degrees as the default and they are the edges that I'd like to make sharp, so I can press Ctrl and E and mark sharp. And I think that's it for the sharp edges. The rest of the objects just need to be smooth. So in object mode, I'm going to have the dish selected, go over to my tools tab and choose smooth, and then as before in the data context choose auto smooth, and now I've got this hard edge around the rim of the dish. And moving on through the objects, click smooth, then auto smooth, and then for the toruses and the sphere at the end, I can just click smooth. So with those selected, I'm going to add to the selection and choose all of the objects and then choose join. And I think that's a pretty good representation of what's going on in the concept. One final thing for this object then, I just want to go into edit mode and I want to select the edge that's at the top of the end here. So I'm still in edge mode, so I'm going to select it, and I want to move my 3D cursor to be in the center of this edge. So I'm going to press Shift and S and then do cursor to selected, and that means that I can now go into object mode and move this origin point to where the 3D cursor is. So I can press Shift, Control, Alt and C and choose origin to 3D cursor again. And the reason I've done that is that that creates a nice pivot for this object when it's reattached to the armature. So if I was to rotate the object, it would rotate from that point. One more thing I've just remembered about this object: if I go back into edit mode and then face mode, I need to poke this n-gon into triangles with Alt and P. So now I want to go back to my layers tab, and I want to change the name of this to be dish. And while I'm here, I'm going to change this layer 11 to ref cube, just so I know what's on each layer. Next, I'm going to work on this laser gun attachment, and in the concept we don't get a really clear look at the back end of it, for example, but what I can see is fairly straightforward. I think there's a tapered cube shape for the main body, and then this quite thick gun barrel at the front, and then it has these circular brackets at the sides and the bottom. Okay, so going back in, I'm going to switch off the layer with the dish on it, and I'm going to move my 3D cursor back to the origin with Shift and C, and then I'm going to make a new cube with Shift and A, and I want to reduce its size with the radius slider just to get it more in line with the reference object I've got. And next, in edit mode, I want to scale this a little bit on the Z axis, so I'm going to press S and then Z and just make that a little bit taller. And then I want to grab the face at the back and pull it out a little bit as well, and then scale that face in on the X axis, so S, X, and just make it a bit more narrow, something like that. And then I want to scale that on the Z axis, so S and then Z, I think something like that. Okay, next I want to go into edge mode, and I want to select the edge ring that goes all the way around the object. So I'm going to press Control and Alt and right click on one of these vertical edges, and then I'm going to bevel those. So I'm going to press Control B and bring that to about there. And this time I want to add a segment to my bevel, just to give it a bit more of a rounded corner. Okay, so next I'm going to select the edges running around the top and the bottom of the object. So I'm going to press Alt and right click on one of them, and then Shift and Alt and select those at the bottom. And I'm going to bevel those as well. So Control B and then just bring that down to about there. But this time I only want one segment in my bevel. So while I'm here, I'm going to Alt and right click and Shift and Alt and right click, and then select these edge loops going around the top and the bottom, and then mark them as sharp. And I want to go into object mode and back to my tools tab. I'm going to apply smoothing and auto smooth, and yeah, I think that looks okay. You may have noticed when I made the dish object that I was applying the smoothing and the auto smooth to each component, and it could be a bit of a time saver if you're happy with the object to combine it all together and then just apply the smoothing once. I do it this way generally just so that I can see how the smoothing affects each component before I commit to a final version of the object, but it's really your preference. Next I'm going to put this object on its own layer, and layer 8 is the next empty one, so I'm going to press M and place it on layer 8. And then back in my layers tab, I'm going to show that layer and then change its name to laser. And then in front view, I'm going to make a new cylinder, which will be the basis for the barrel. And going back to the concept, as well as the barrel itself, there is this kind of circular object at the bottom. So I'm going to start with that and then extrude the barrel out of it. So back in Blender, I'm going to press Shift A and make a new cylinder and make it face my current view. And I'm going to change its vertices value to 24, and then I'm going to drop the radius, and I want it to be almost as wide as the front face of the body, but not quite. I think that's okay. Okay, next I'm just going to go into edit mode and then go into face mode and then select this face at the back, and I want to bring this all the way forwards, and then using Control I can snap it to the front of the object here. And now I don't need that face, so I can press X and delete it. Next I want to select the face at the front and bring that much further back, something like that. And now I want to inset this, so I'm going to press I and bring that down to about there. And now I'm going to extrude with E and bring that forwards. And that's the main body of the barrel, so now I need to give that some thickness, so I'm going to inset again and bring that down to about there, and then extrude it again to create the interior of the barrel. And in this case I want this face to be in front of the main body object. I don't want it to intersect it, so I'm going to pull it back until it does and then pull it a bit further forwards. So next, in edge mode, I want to select the edge loops at the edge of the base there and also at the front of the barrel, and I'm going to bevel those, so Control B, and then using Shift to control it a bit better, bring that to about there. Next I want to mark some sharp edges, so I'm going to Shift and Alt and select all of the edges that I want to be sharp, and then Control E, mark sharp. And while I'm here, I want this large face inside to be poked into triangles, so I'm going to go into face mode, and that's still selected, and then press Alt and P. And then back in object mode, I can go to my tools tab, and as before, just apply smoothing and auto smooth. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So now I want to go into my front view, and looking back at the concept, these are kind of bracket objects. I've got a very short cylindrical shape here, and then almost half a sphere with a bit more of a pointed shape to it. So I'm going to begin by making that. I'm going to go into my mesh menu with Shift A and make a UV sphere, but this is way too high poly, so I'm going to change the segments down to, let's try 16, and the rings, let's try 8, and yeah, I think that will do. I'm now going to scale this down, so I'm going to use the size slider and just bring that right down, and then move the object to the bottom there. And I'm going to scale this even further, so I'm going to press S and just bring that right down. I think something like that will do. And now back in my front view and edit mode and wireframe, I'm going to deselect the faces that I want to keep. So I'm going to press B and then middle click and just select the faces up to about that point there, and then press X and delete the remainder. So now I can select all of these faces, and I want to scale them on the Y and the X axis. So I'm going to press S and then Shift Z, and then just bring that down to be a bit more of a pointed shape. And while I'm here, I'm going to scale the whole thing up a little bit. Also make it a bit taller, so S and then Z, just to bring that up into more of a kind of a bullet shape. So my front view, yeah, I think that's okay. Okay, next I'm going to go into edge mode, and then I want to Alt and right click the edge loop at the open end of the object, and then press F, and that will fill that open border with geometry. But of course that's made a big n-gon, so I'm going to press Alt and P to poke that into triangles. And next I want to duplicate those faces, so I'm going to press Shift and D and then right click and then just move those up, something like that. And then in my front view, I just want to align this a bit better. I want to extrude these up, so I'm going to press E and make that kind of short coin shaped cylinder that's in the concept. Okay, so back in my front view, I'm going to zoom out and look at it in object mode, and I think size wise it could maybe be a little bit larger, so I'm going to scale the whole object up to something like that. And in my side view, I'm just going to bring it further forwards to about there. Okay, now I want to do some smoothing on this, but I'm going to go into edit mode and this time use the select option to select my edges to be made sharp. So I'm going to do select sharp edges, and in this case it's selected a couple of edges down here that I don't want, so I'm going to change my sharpness value. Let's change that to let's try 40, and yeah, I think that's okay. So now I can mark those as sharp with Control and E and mark sharp. And now in object mode, I'm going to apply my smoothing and my auto smooth, and yeah, I think that's fine. So next I want to duplicate this and put some copies on either side of this main body object. So I'm going to go into my front view and I want to duplicate and rotate these around the 3D cursor. So I'm going to change my pivot to 3D cursor and then press Shift D and then right click and leave it in place, and then press R, -90, And next I'm going to just position this, move that a bit further down I think, and yeah, I think that's okay. So next I want to go back into my front view and I want to mirror this geometry to the other side. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then select everything with A and then A again. And then I want to duplicate the geometry with Shift D and right click and leave it in place. And then press Ctrl M for mirror and then X for the X axis and press return. And next I want to flip these normals back the right way because as before it's flipped these face normals. So I'm going to press Ctrl F for the faces menu and then flip normals. So okay, back in object mode, I think that's looking okay. I'm going to combine all of this into one object now. So with that one still selected, I'm going to select the bottom bracket and then the barrel and then the body and then click join. Looking back at these side brackets here, I think this cylindrical section is actually a bit bigger in relation to the object next to it. And so I'm going to go back in and change that. I'm going to go into edit mode and drop my current selection. And then I want to hover over each of these cylindrical sections and press L to select linked. And once I've done that, I want to change my pivot point back to median. And now I want to scale that on the Y and the Z. So I'm going to press S and then Shift X to lock out the X axis. And I just want to scale those up a little bit. And now I want to break up these n-gons at the top and the bottom. So I'm going to Control Tab into vertex mode and drop my current selection. And I want to select the vertices in the corner here and then press J and connect them together. And then I want to select this one and that one at the opposite corner and press J again. And repeating the process on this side. And then I'm going to do the same at the bottom. And finally for this object, I'm going to go into face mode and select this face at the top. And I'm going to move the origin for the object to the center of this face. So first of all, I'm going to press Shift and S and move cursor to selected. And then in object mode, I'm going to press Shift, Control, Alt and C and then choose origin to 3D cursor. Next I'm going to make this claw attachment, and this is a bit more involved because it involves the separate pieces for the pincer. So to begin with, I'm going to go back into Blender and I'm going to go to my layers tab and switch off my laser layer, and I'm going to move my 3D cursor back to the origin with Shift and C, and I'm going to begin this one with a cylinder. So I'm going to go into my front view and then press Shift and A and then mesh cylinder, and I want to scale this down, so I'm going to change the radius, make it more like this, and then change the depth. And I think the vertices value of 32 will be fine. It's quite a prominent feature, so I'd like it to be nice and round. So with that done, I want to go into edit mode and select this face at the top and then scale that down to taper the object a bit. And looking back at the concept, I now need to make another cylindrical extrusion at the top here. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to inset this face with I and bring it down to about there, and then extrude it up to something like that. So again, looking back at the concept, I now need to make another extrusion at the bottom, but this one is kind of split in half by this hinge here. So I'm going to begin by selecting the face at the bottom and insetting that and extruding that down. And as I go along, I'll split this section into two so that there's a kind of a curved semicircular section here and here, and then the hinge will go inside. So next I want to go back into my front view and I want to make a new cylinder. So I'm going to go into object mode and then Shift A and make a new cylinder, and this time I want it to face my current view and I want it to be quite a bit smaller. I'm going to go into wireframe and I'm going to change the radius to something more like that. And the depth I don't really mind for now. I'm just going to position this down here, and this will be this cylindrical shape here. And again, I don't really mind that it's quite round, because half of the cylinder will be removed at a certain point when I've made the other shapes. So I want to snap this on the Z-axis with Control. I want to snap the midpoint to this bottom surface here. And then in my ortho view, I want to scale this object in. So I'm going to scale it on the Y-axis with S and Y, and then just make that a bit more narrow, something like that. Okay, next I want to go into front view, and now I want to make the claw shapes. So looking at the shapes of these claws, they're more narrow at the sides here, and they're a bit thicker in the center. So I'm imagining the cross section of this is almost like a diamond shape. So what I'm going to do in Blender first is create that cross section, and I'm going to do that using a curve. So I'm going to go to Shift A, and this time choose Curve and then Circle. And I want to align it to my view, and I want to change the radius to something quite a bit smaller. And then over here in the data context, that changes to information about curves. So what I can do is change this resolution slider, and I'm going to knock that all the way down to 1, and it creates a diamond square shape. And now I can scale that in the Z-axis. So I'm going to press S and then Z, and just make that a much more narrow shape, something like that. And I'm going to move this over to the side so I can see it when I'm in solid view. And next I want to create the basic shape of the claw. So I'm going to do that with a curve as well. I'm going to press Shift and A, and then Curve, and then choose Bezier. And again I'm going to choose Align to View. And I get this kind of wave shape here, and I need to move it into place and then change its shape. So what I can do is just press G and bring it down here, and then I can rotate it. And then in edit mode, you can see I get these kind of series of arrows showing the direction of the curve, and at either end there is a vertex and some handles here. So what I'm going to do before I start shaping this, I'm going to go back to object mode, and I'm going to go down here to the geometry section, and where it says bevel object, I'm going to click in this eyedropper, and I'm going to choose my profile object. So if I go into solid view, you can see that it's created this kind of strip of geometry with this diamond cross section. So back in wireframe and front view, I can go to edit mode, and I can change the shape of this to match my claw. So I'm going to select this point at the bottom and then just move that over, and I want to select the one at the top and press G this time, and just bring that down so it's roughly touching this cylinder here. And now if I select one of these handles at the ends of these lines, I can move that and make it a bit more evenly distributed along the curve, and taking these points and moving them around, I just want to get a basic claw shape, and then I'll refine it. So I'm going to move this up, and looking back at the concept, actually I think this cylinder is actually quite a bit wider than I've currently got it. If you look at the main body of this object, this cylinder isn't too far away from the extents here. So I'm just going to quickly change that. I want to go back into object mode and select this cylinder and then scale it up. So something like, I think something like that's probably more appropriate. And going back to my new curve object, I just want to move that down so that the end is pretty much touching that cylinder. Okay, so back in edit mode, I want to change this a little bit more. So I'm going to select that handle, and then select that one, and move that over there like that. Okay, I think that will do for now. What I want to do next is to make this taper towards the end so it becomes more of a pointed shape rather than just being this very even kind of thickness all the way along. And the way I can do that is by using a taper object. There's an option for it here. So what I'm going to do is make a new curve. I'm going to go into object mode, and I'm going to press Shift and A again, and then choose Curve Bezier again. And if I align this one to my view, I'm just going to move this one over to the side so that I can work with it while looking at the claw. And if I select this object again and then use the eyedropper in the taper object field, I can click on that and then choose my new curve. And you can see what it's done to this object here. It is tapering it, but it's not really doing exactly what I want. So I need to modify this curve to make this object behave properly. So I'm going to go into my front view again and go into edit mode. And then I can start changing these points and handles to get more of a grip on what's supposed to be going on here. So first of all, I'm going to grab this point here at the end and lift it up. And as I do that, you can see the top part of my claw becoming thicker, which is what I want. And now I can select this handle and move that down. And then move that out a little bit. And the curve on this is quite steep. It comes to a bit too much of a point here. So what I'm going to do is select this handle here and bring that in, and then bring that one in. And then I'm going to select the point in the middle and move that up. And I'm also going to just move the whole thing over a little bit as well. So you can see as I make tweaks to this, the shape of this object changes. So it's really just a case of tweaking and changing this and coming up with something that I like. So let's go back over here, move this one up, make it a bit thicker, and grab this handle maybe, move it over. Yeah, that's not too bad. And as always with Blender's modeling tools, if I hold down Shift, I can move these points around very gradually and get real control over where everything ends up. I think something like that's pretty good. And I think if anything, the claw overall is quite big, but I can come back and change that later. For now I'm quite happy with the result. If I just look at it all the way around and get a feel for how it's working. Yeah, I think that's okay. So back in object mode, if I select this object, you can see that the ends of this object are open, and there's an option down here in the geometry section called fill caps. So if I click that on, it will create a face at either end. And now that I'm happy with that, I can make this proper polygonal geometry. But before I do, I want to double check the resolution of it. So if I go back to wireframe, you can see the number of divisions I've got here. There are quite a few. So it defaults to 12 in this resolution field here. And just to show you, I'm going to click and drag down. So if I want to make something simpler, I can just reduce this value. And I think 8 is plenty. So I'm going to go with 8. And then I want to make this into geometry. So what I can do is go to Object and then Convert, which is Alt and C, and then choose Mesh from Curve. So now that becomes proper geometry with faces and vertices that I can work with as normal. And now that I've got that shape, I don't need my curve objects anymore. So I'm going to select those and then delete them. So I'm quite happy with the claw for now. I'm going to come back to it and make some changes later. But next I want to work on the main body of this object. So I'm going to make some changes to this hinge. I'm going to go into edit mode and then select this face at the end. And I want to hold Control and then click on the green arrow and then just snap that to that vertex in the cylindrical shape there. Then I want to do the same on the other side so that it's even. And next I want to go back into object mode and then hide everything else with Shift and H. And back in edit mode, I want to have both of these faces selected, and I want to poke those into triangles with Alt and P. Next, in my front view, I want to go into wireframe and I want to select all of the faces that make up the top half of this object. So I'm going to deselect everything and then box select the faces at the top. And before I delete them, I want to extrude them upwards. So I'm going to press E and bring that up there. And then I can delete those faces. And next I want to go into edge mode and Alt and right click on the edge at the top of this object now. So back in object mode, I'm going to press Alt H and bring everything back. And then reselecting this object, I'm going to press Tab for edit mode again. And with this edge selected, I want to go into front view, and then holding Control, I want to click on the blue arrow and then snap it to one of the vertices at the bottom of this main part of the body. Okay, next I want to cut a groove into this smaller cylindrical extrusion at the bottom of the main body. So I'm going to go into object mode and select that object. And first of all, I want to go into edit mode and I want to connect these vertices together. So if I go into vertex mode, I'll show you which ones I mean. I'm going to press A and deselect everything. I want to select the vertex that is lined up with this hinge object, and then select the same vertex on the opposite side, and then press J to connect them together. And then I want to do the same on the other side. And now if I go back into object mode, I'm going to hide everything else and then go back into edit mode. And the next thing I want to do is select these vertices and then press X and then dissolve them. And that creates this kind of strange face here, but I'll clean that up next. I'm just going to go to the other side and remove those vertices in the same way. And now I want to select the vertex that's at the bottom of this shape here, and this will make up the side of the notch that I'm creating. So with those two vertices selected, I can press J, and that makes much more recognizable geometry there. So going back to the other side and doing the same thing. And so now I've made this kind of clearance in the center. So while I'm here, I've got an end gone, so I'm going to clean that up. I'm just going to select the opposite vertices and connect them with edges with J. And yeah, I think that's okay. So now back in object mode, I'm going to press Alt and H and bring everything back. And I'm just going to look around the object, try and get a feel for how it's looking. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, so now I want to go back to the claw and rework some of that and make it work properly with the main body of this object. Before I move on, I'm going to hide the grid floor because I find it gets in my way sometimes. And back in my front view and wireframe, I want to select the claw, and I think it's maybe a bit too long. So what I'm going to do is select the segment at the top and delete it. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and then in vertex mode I'm going to box select the vertices at the top, and this time instead of just deleting them, I'm going to press Alt and M to bring up the merge menu and then choose at center. So it just merges them all into a single point, and then I can press X and then dissolve vertices. So back in my solid view, you can see I've now just got a clean diamond shaped face there. Okay, the next thing I want to do is go back into my front view and object mode, and I want to position this a bit better, so I'm going to press G, and I want this to be resting pretty much at the center of the cylinder so that it touches the edge. And now that I've done that, I think I need to do it a bit more precisely. So what I'm going to do is move this back out and go back into edit mode and face mode. And with that central face selected, I'm going to press Shift and S and then choose cursor to selected. And then back in object mode, I'm going to press Shift, Control, Alt and C and then choose origin to 3D cursor. So next I'm going to select the hinge object and hide everything else. And I want to snap this object here, the claw, to the what was the center of the cylinder where the origin is currently. So back in my front view and wireframe, I want to select the claw, and I'm going to hold Control and then click on the red arrow and then snap it to the nearest vertex. And then I'm going to do the same in the Z axis. And then I'm going to rotate this, and I'm going to hold down Shift and rotate it so that the top edge of this claw is as vertical as I can make it. I think something like that will do. So it's nicely lined up with the sides of this extruded part of this cylinder. So bringing everything back with Alt and H, what I've got now is a bit of an issue. I've got the rotation of the claw. So if you look at the way it's rotated here, if you think of that as the most open that the claw can be, what I want to do is have it so that it doesn't overlap with this section of the object down here. So I'm going to go into edit mode on that object and then vertex mode. And I want to drop my current selection and box select all of the vertices here. And then I just want to move those up so that they're just above this corner of the claw so that there's a bit of clearance. And if I go back to object mode and select this hinge object, I've got a similar issue there. So I want to go into edit mode again, and I've still got my vertices selected from before, and I can hold Control and click on the blue arrow and then just snap that up to the top again. Okay, so back in solid view I've got my claw, and just as a test I'm going to go into object mode, and I want to change the 3D cursor to be at the center here where this origin point is on this object, and this is where I want my origin for my claw to be as well. So I'm going to go into edit mode and select this vertex and then this vertex, and then I want to press Shift and S and then choose cursor to selected, so it puts the cursor basically where that origin point is. And then back in object mode I want to select my claw, and I want to press Shift, Control, Alt and C again, and then choose origin to 3D cursor. So back in my front view, if I was to press R and rotate my claw, it will rotate around and it will stay at the edge of this cylindrical shape. It will not intersect it. And also, because I've rotated this and so on, I've got some transforms here that I want to apply. So I'm going to press Control A and then choose rotation and scale. Next, now that I know that the claw is in its final position, I want to reshape it a little bit. I think it's looking a bit strange. So I'm going to go into edit mode and wireframe. And first of all, I want to bring the end of the claw to an absolute point. So I'm going to box select all of the vertices at the end, and I've got another selection up here, so I need to drop that one first. And I'm going to reselect these ones, and then press Alt and M again, and then choose at center. So it just merges them all into a single point. And now I want to press G, and then just grab that and move it around, something like that. And then I want to drop that selection and then select the next division up, and then just press S and scale that down and maybe move it around a little bit just to soften off this curve. And next I want to drop that selection and select the group of vertices here in the center, and for this I want to enable proportional editing. And if I press G, I've got quite a big fall off here, so I need to bring that right down. I'm just going to press page down, and so I'm going to, it's a bit too low. Do something like that. And then also I want to massage some of the other points around. I'm just going to press G. Change that as well. So let's see how that looks in solid view. I'm going to deselect everything, and back in object mode I just want to check my rotation again. So yeah, I think that works. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is start changing these objects and adding some smoothing and some bevels. So I'm going to go back to the main body and work on that first. So I'm going to hide everything else, and I want to go to edit mode and then edge mode and drop any current selections. And first of all I want to Alt and right click, and then Shift and Alt and right click on edges that I want to bevel. And I want to bevel these ones at the end of these extrusions here. And before I bevel them, I'm going to mark them as sharp. So Control E and then mark sharp. And then I can do Control B and bring that down to, I think, about there. And that's not too bad. Next I want to select a few more edges and make those sharp. So I'm going to Alt and right click on that edge loop there. And then down here where these extrusions are, I want to select all of the ones in the corners here. So I'm just going to hold down Shift and right click on those edges, and on the corresponding ones on the other side. And I also want to select the edges running around the bottom of these extrusions, so Alt with Shift and right click. I think that's okay. So then Control E, mark sharp, and then back in object mode I want to, as before, go back to my Tools tab and click Smooth, and then in my data context enable auto smooth. And yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, before I move on to the next object, I just want to select this n-gon at the top. I'm going to face mode and then press Alt and P to convert that to triangles. And then I've also got some n-gons down here. So I'm going to go back into vertex mode and then select each opposite vertex and press J. Okay, then I want to press Alt and H and bring everything else back. And I want to select this hinge object. And I want to bevel these edges around here. But before I do, I think I might have some, yeah, I've got some transforms here. So I want to press Ctrl A and apply rotation and scale. And if I don't do that and I try and bevel the edges, I'll get an unpredictable result. So with that done, I can go into edit mode and I'm going to go into edge mode. And then I'm going to drop my current selection and then Alt and right click the edge loops going around the main shape of the object, and then press Ctrl B and bring that down to about there, I think. Okay, so going back to my edge smoothing, I'm going to go and make all of these sharp edges. And just for the variety, I'm going to press Ctrl and Alt and then click on this edge ring and do Ctrl and Alt and Shift and click on this edge ring on the other side and then do Ctrl E and then clear sharp. So back in object mode, I can apply smooth and auto smooth. Okay, so now I want to give the claw a bit more definition, and the first thing I'm going to do is make it a bit thicker. So I'm going to go into edit mode and select everything and then scale everything on the y-axis, so S and then Y, and then just move that up to about there. And I've just noticed I've still got proportional editing switched on, so I'm going to disable that and then try that again, so S and Y. And next I want to apply some sharp edges to this too. So what I'm going to do is Alt and right click on the edge loop going down the center, and I want to bevel this, so I'm going to press Ctrl B and bevel it, but you can see what happens at the end where it's pointed, so I need to be a bit more careful about what I do with this. If I make the amount too high, it will do some kind of crazy stuff. So what I can do is do Ctrl B again, and if you look here, even though I've left it in quite a bad state, what I've got here is a clamp overlap option. So if I enable that, it will stop the bevel operation damaging the geometry too much, which can be quite useful sometimes. So next what I want to do is select this edge at the end, and then I want to press Alt and M and then choose merge at center, and that will make that a point again. But I've got a kind of a strange shape here now. So I want to go into object mode and frame my selection, in this case with decimal point on my number pad, and I want to change this geometry a little bit. I'm not really happy with the end of this, so I'm going to go into edit mode and wireframe, and I want to go into vertex mode and then select these vertices and then just scale them a little bit in the X axis, so S and then X. And then I'm going to add to the selection by doing another box select there and then moving them over and then selecting the one at the very end and then moving that over there, and then just massaging some of these points around to get a nicer curve on the object. And yeah, I think that's okay. Okay, so next I want to go back into edit mode and edge mode, and I want to Alt and right click on this edge loop and then select this edge loop as well, and the same on the other side. And I also want to select the outer edge loops, and I want to mark these as sharp, so Control and E and then mark sharp. And going back into object mode, I'm going to hide everything else, and I've got some smoothing issues at the end here, so yeah, I've got an end on there. So I'm going to go into vertex mode and select these opposite vertices and connect them with J. And then back in edge mode, I'm going to Alt and right click and then Shift and Alt, and then mark those as sharp as well. So back in object mode, I'm going to go back to my smoothing option and apply auto smooth as well. And now it's looking a bit more mechanical. So I'm going to press Alt and H and bring everything back. And yeah, I think that's looking okay now. Okay, so what I want to do is combine the main body sections together. The hinge, even though I've called it a hinge, won't actually move. The claws though will move. So I want to combine the body together and then leave the claws as separate objects, and I'll parent them to the body. So what I want to do first is select the hinge object and then select the main body and then click the join button. And next I want to duplicate this claw to the other side. So I'm going to do this in my front view just so I can see what's going on. And I'm going to press Shift D and then right click to leave it in place, and then press Control M for mirror and then press X. And even though that looks okay, if you look over here in the properties shelf, I've got a scale value of -1 on the X, and that's part of the mirror process. So if I press Control A and apply that rotation and scale, it flips the normals. So I need to go into edit mode and then select everything, and then I need to press Control and F and choose flip normals. So before I parent these claw objects to the main body, what I want to do is select the body and move the pivot point to be at the top of this object here. So in edit mode, I'm going to go into vertex mode and select this vertex at the top, and then press Shift and S and then choose cursor to selected. Next, back in object mode, I'm going to do Control Alt Shift and C and choose origin to 3D cursor. Okay, with that done, I want to select both of my claw objects and then the main body, and then press Control and P for the parent menu and choose object. So now if I move these around or rotate them, if I go into my front view, they will rotate with the main body, but the claws can also be rotated independently. Finally, I'm going to select all of these objects and add them to a new layer. So I'm going to press M and move them to the next available layer, which is layer 9. And then in my layers tab, I'm going to change that to be claw. And now I'm ready to move on. So next I want to show my dish and my laser. And looking back at the concept, I want to change the scale of some of these objects. I think the laser in particular is a bit smaller here. And if anything, I think the claw could stand to be a bit larger. So going back in, I'm going to select the laser and scale it down a little bit. I think something more like that. And then I'm going to select the body of the claw and scale it up. Something like that. And I can always change this stuff later. I just wanted to get something that's a bit closer. So next I want to place these attachments at the ends of the armatures, and I'm going to show my machine layer. And before I do any placement, I want to rework this end piece of the armature. Again, going back to the concept, you can see that there's almost like a telescopic aerial kind of setup here, and also some cylindrical pivot objects. So I'm going to make those first. So with the end of the armature selected, I'm going to press Shift and H and hide everything else. And then in edit mode, I'm going to go into face mode and select this face at the end. And then I want to insert that with I, bring that down to about there, and then extrude it forwards with E. And then repeating the process, I'm going to insert again and extrude again. And with these vertical surfaces I've just made, I'm going to make them a bit more interesting hopefully by going to edge mode and selecting those edge loops, and then bringing them a bit further back on the X just to make a bit more of an interesting silhouette. And next I want to add to that selection, and I'm going to press Shift and Alt and choose these edge loops at the bottom of these extrusions, and then press Control E and do Mark Sharp. And now I want to go into object mode and then press Alt and H to bring everything back. Because if you look at this strut now, let's go into wireframe, this new feature I've just extruded out is actually inside our kind of reference object for the attachments. and I think this strut is a bit too long already. So when I add on the pivot object and then the attachment, this whole lower arm section is going to be too long. So I want to go into edit mode and then vertex mode, and then drop my current selection and select all of the verts at the end there. And in my front view, I just want to pull this further back on the x-axis. I think something like that. So that's now quite a bit shorter, but it allows me to have room for my pivot objects and then the attachment. So next, what I want to do is go into face mode and drop my current selection, and I want to select the face at the end again and snap my 3D cursor to the center of that. So I'm going to press Shift and S and then choose cursor to selected. And now I don't actually need that face anymore, so I can press X and delete it. And next I want to go into object mode and front view again. I'm just going to hide everything else for now with Shift and H. And I want to make a new cylinder at this point. So I'm going to do Shift and A and then do Mesh Cylinder and then align it to my current view and then scale the radius right down so that I can see it. I think something like that. And lower my vertices count to, let's try 12. And I also want to change the depth as well. So I'm going to bring that right down as well. Maybe not that far. Something more like that, I think. Okay, so back in my front view, I'm going to go to the X arrow on the gizmo and just bring that forwards so that the arm is embedded into this cylinder. And now I want to duplicate the cylinder. But before I do that, I want to break up this n-gon. So I'm going to go into edit mode and then select these faces at the ends and then press Alt and P. And now in my front view again, I'm going to go into object mode and duplicate along the X by pressing X and move it out to around here. And then I want to scale it. So I'm just going to press S and scale it up. I think something like that will do. And then move it a bit further back. And I want it so that the top part of this cylinder is just inside this larger one. I think something like that will be fine. Okay, now I want to combine these together. So with this one still selected, I'm going to shift select that one and then go to my Tools tab and choose Join. And next I want to do some smoothing on this. I'm not going to bevel this. I think this is quite a small object, so it doesn't really need a bevel. But I want to add some sharp edges. So back in edit mode, I want to go into edge mode and then select the relevant edge loops. And then do Control E again and mark sharp. And then back in object mode, I'm going to activate smoothing and auto smooth. Okay, so this object rotates around its origin, and I just want to make sure that that rotation will work if it rotates independently of the section of the armature here. So I'm going to press R and then Y, and yeah, I think that will work. There are no parts of the armature kind of poking out of the sides of this object as I rotate it around. So yeah, I think that's fine. So now I'm ready to move my attachments into place, and with this object still selected, I'm going to go into edit mode and vertex mode and select the vertex at the center of this larger group of faces at the cap of this cylinder. And then I want to snap my 3D cursor to the center of that selection with Shift and S. And next I want to go back to object mode and I'm going to bring everything back with Alt and H. And going back to my attachments, I'm going to do this in my front view. First of all, I'm going to move the claw. So I'm going to select the body of the claw and I want to snap it to the position of the 3D cursor there. So I'm going to press Shift S again and then do selection to cursor. And I want to rotate it so that it's aligned with the armature. So I'm going to do R, -90. Next I want to move the dish. So I'm going to do the same thing. Do Shift S, selection to cursor. And I also want to rotate this, so R, -90. And I want this to be pointing at the ground. So in my side view, I'm going to do R, -90. And going back to front view, I want to choose my laser object and repeat the process. So Shift S, selection to cursor, and then R, -90. And then in my side view, I'm going to do R, -90 again. Okay, so now that I've rotated and positioned these, I'm just going to delete this stand-in object before I move on. I want to apply my transformations for these objects so that I don't get any strange results when I try and rotate them when they're parts of the armatures. So I'm going to select all of the parts and then do Control A and then apply rotation and scale. Also, I need to select this pivot object I've just made and press Control A again and apply rotation and scale on that as well. So next I want to duplicate copies of my new armatures and replace the blockout versions. So first of all, with this pivot object selected, I'm going to select the next part up on the armature and parent that with Control P and then choose Object. And then I'm going to Shift select the rest of the armature and duplicate it and then leave it in place. And I'm just going to hide that copy with H. And next I'm going to choose the body of the claw and parent that to this pivot object, again with Control and P. And now I want to rotate this armature with the claw and rotate it to this point here to replace this blockout version. So what I want to do is select the top part of the armature, and I'm going to use the 3D cursor at the origin with Shift and C to rotate the whole thing around the torus. So I need to change my pivot point to 3D cursor, and then I can press R, Z, 123.75, and that adds it to this area here to replace this one, but I actually want it over here, so I can press Shift R and it will repeat that rotation for me. And now that that's in place, I can select the old pieces and delete them. And while I'm here, I just want to give it a basic pose. Looking back at the concept, it's kind of stretched out and angled downwards a little bit, so going back in, I want to rotate this, but because it's off axis now, I want to use the local rotations. So to begin with, I'm going to change my pivot back to median point, and then I want to press R and then Y twice to activate the local axis, and then just bring that down to about there, and then working down the object, doing the same thing, R, Y, Y, and again. And for the claw itself, I want to rotate it so that it's about 90 degrees on its axis. So I'm going to select the pivot object and this time press R, X, X and bring that down to about there. Okay, moving on then, I want to press Alt H and bring the other objects back, and then select the armature again and duplicate it again and then hide it again. And this time I want to parent the laser to this armature. So with that selected, I want to select the pivot and press Control P, choose Object, and then I want to select the top part of the armature and change my pivot point back to 3D cursor, and this time press R, Z, 123.75, and that's in the correct place, so I can delete this version. And again, I want to pose this, so I'm going to change my pivot back to median and select this part here. And just looking at the concept quickly, I can't really see exactly what's going on with the armature there, so I'm going to leave the top part pretty much horizontal and then angle these other sections in. So going back in, I'm going to leave that one there and select this one and then choose R, Y, Y and bring that down to somewhere like that, and then bring this one much further in, so R, Y, Y, something like that I think, and then I can choose the pivot and then do R, Y, Y and make it so that the laser is pointing in a more horizontal direction. Okay, pressing Alt H again and bringing back the remaining armature, I'm going to select my dish object and parent that to the pivot, so Control P again. And I don't need to rotate this one, but I want to pose it again. So I'm going to select this object and then press R, Y and move that up. And rotate this one further down like that. And then moving down the object, do this kind of thing, select the pivot and then R, Y again. And yeah, I think that's okay. Right, looking at it straight away, I'm thinking that the attachments themselves are a bit too small. Looking back at the concept, I think the dish especially is sticking out as being very small. So what I'm going to do is select the attachments, and in the case of the claw, I'm just going to select the body, and I want to scale them, but if I press S now, it's going to scale them away from the median point of that selection. So in my pivot menu, I'm going to choose individual origins instead, and that will scale each object from the individual origins. So now if I press S, they all scale from their pivot. So I'm going to bring that up quite a bit, and as I say, I may change that again later when I'm tweaking the proportions of things, but I think that just straight away looks quite a lot better. So I think that's pretty much it for the modeling of the machine. I think it's looking quite good. I'll be making tweaks and changes later on, especially as I get towards the texturing phase. But for now, I think that's looking pretty good, and I'm going to move on to refine the rest of the geometry.
Hi, ADBorrows here, just wrapping it up. Many thanks to Martin for taking us through this chapter. Next time we'll be finalising everything, and that will finish off all of the whole modelling section. So congratulations, we're practically done. Hang in there and we'll see you next time for the final modelling pass.